Gender identity is a deeply ingrained aspect of human experience shaped by biological, psychological, and cultural factors. Contrary to claims that gender identity is an ideology, extensive scientific research confirms that it has a strong foundation in genetics, neuroscience, endocrinology, and psychology. The notion that gender is merely a social construct fails to account for the vast body of evidence demonstrating that gender identity is an innate aspect of human identity. Understanding and accepting gender identity is crucial not only for affirming individual rights but also for preventing psychological trauma, particularly in children and adolescents. Scientific studies on genetics suggest that gender identity has a hereditary component. Twin studies have consistently shown that identical twins are significantly more likely than fraternal twins to share a transgender identity, indicating a genetic influence. In one study, 33% of identical male twins and 23% of identical female twins were concordant for being transgender, compared to just 2% of fraternal twins. This finding strongly supports the conclusion that gender identity is partially heritable. Further molecular genetic studies have identified specific gene variants associated with gender identity. In 2020, researchers discovered 21 variants in 19 genes related to estrogen signaling in the brain. These genes are known to play a role in the sexual differentiation of the brain during prenatal development. If these processes are disrupted, a person's gender identity may not align with their assigned sex at birth. For example, certain genetic variations may prevent the typical masculinization of the brain in XY individuals or promote additional masculinization in XX individuals, leading to a gender identity that differs from the one traditionally expected based on chromosomal sex. These findings illustrate that gender identity is not arbitrarily chosen but rather biologically influenced from birth. Neuroscientific research further supports the biological basis of gender identity by revealing distinct patterns in brain structure and function that correlate with an individual's experienced gender rather than their assigned sex. A landmark 1995 study found that a specific region of the brain, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis (BSDC), which is typically larger in males than in females, was found to be female-sized in transgender women. Crucially, this difference was present regardless of hormone treatment, sexual orientation, or age, indicating that it was a fundamental characteristic rather than a result of external influences. Later MRI studies confirmed that transgender individuals have neural structures that align more closely with their gender identity than with their assigned sex. One study in 2013 found that trans men, individuals assigned female at birth who identify as male, had brain characteristics that resembled those of cisgender men, while trans women had neural patterns similar to cisgender women. Another review in 2019 reported differences in cortical thickness, gray matter volume, white matter pathways, and brain connectivity, all of which supported the idea that transgender individuals have brains that reflect their experienced gender rather than their assigned sex. This growing body of evidence refutes the claim that gender identity is purely psychological or socially imposed. Instead, it shows that gender identity is closely tied to neurobiology and is influenced by prenatal brain development. Endocrinology research also demonstrates that prenatal hormone exposure plays a key role in shaping gender identity. During fetal development, sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen guide the differentiation of both the body and the brain. If hormonal exposure is atypical, an individual's gender identity may not align with their physical sex characteristics. Clinical observations of intersex individuals provide compelling evidence for the role of hormones in gender identity. For instance, individuals with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome (CIS) who are genetically male XY but whose bodies cannot respond to testosterone typically develop a female gender identity despite their male chromosomes. Conversely, some XY infants with conditions such as 5-alpha reductase deficiency or cloacal exstrophy who were raised as girls due to ambiguous genitalia later asserted a male identity despite being socialized as female. These cases suggest that gender identity is not dictated solely by upbringing but is deeply influenced by biological processes. One of the most well-known cases that underscores this point is that of David Reimer, a boy who was reassigned female after a botched circumcision. Despite being raised as a girl, Reimer persistently identified as male, illustrating that gender identity cannot be arbitrarily assigned and is instead a deeply ingrained sense of self. These findings confirm that gender identity has a biological foundation and cannot be dismissed as a mere social construct. Psychological research further affirms that gender identity is an intrinsic part of human development. Studies have shown that children become aware of their gender identity between the ages of 2 and 5 and that this identity remains remarkably stable over time even in the face of external pressures. Research with transgender children has demonstrated that their gender identity is as deeply rooted as that of cisgender children. A 2015 study using implicit association tests with transgender children found that their responses were indistinguishable from those of cisgender children of the same gender, indicating that their gender identity was genuine and not a product of confusion or social influence. Longitudinal studies also show that when children consistently and persistently assert a gender identity different from their assigned sex, they are unlikely to later change their identification. These findings challenge the notion that gender identity is a flexible or socially imposed trait. Rather, they highlight that gender identity is an enduring aspect of an individual's self-concept. Cultural and historical perspectives provide further evidence that gender diversity has always existed and is not a modern ideological invention. Many societies throughout history have recognized more than two genders or have had cultural roles for individuals who did not conform to binary gender norms. More than 150 Native American tribes have historically acknowledged two-spirit individuals who were respected members of their communities with distinct social roles. In South Asia, the Hijra community has existed for centuries as a recognized third-gender category. Other cultures, such as the Zapotec people of Mexico with their muxas and the Bakla of the Philippines, have long embraced gender diversity. Even in Western history, transgender identities were documented as early as the 19th century, with medical professionals studying individuals who consistently identified as a gender different from their assigned sex. The early 20th century saw further recognition of transgender identities through the work of sexologists like Magnus Hirschfeld, who advocated for the rights of transgender individuals. The persistence of gender-diverse identities across cultures and time periods disproves the claim that transgender identities are a recent phenomenon. Instead, they demonstrate that gender identity is a fundamental aspect of human society. The acceptance of gender identity is crucial for preventing trauma, particularly in childhood and adolescence. Research consistently shows that transgender and gender-diverse children who are supported in their identities have significantly better mental health outcomes than those who face rejection. One study found that transgender children who were affirmed in their gender had normal levels of depression and only slightly elevated anxiety compared to their cisgender peers. These findings demonstrate that when transgender children are supported, they experience typical psychological development and well-being. In contrast, rejection of gender identity has severe consequences. Studies have shown that transgender individuals who experience family rejection are at a dramatically higher risk of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation. Family rejection is one of the strongest predictors of poor mental health outcomes among transgender youth. Conversely, transgender youth who receive family support have significantly lower rates of suicide attempts and self-harm. Research from the Family Acceptance Project found that LGBTQ youth with supportive families were almost 50% less likely to attempt suicide compared to those from rejecting families. Even having a single affirming adult in a child's life has been shown to reduce suicide risk. Schools that implement inclusive policies, such as respecting students' chosen names and pronouns, allowing access to gender-affirming restrooms, and fostering an accepting environment, also see improvements in student mental health and academic success. These findings highlight the profound impact that acceptance has on mental health and demonstrate that affirming gender identity is a protective factor against psychological distress. The scientific consensus is clear. Gender identity is a real, biologically influenced phenomenon that is not an ideology but an essential component of human identity. Evidence from genetics, neuroscience, endocrinology, and psychology supports the conclusion that gender identity is deeply rooted in biology and not simply the result of socialization or personal choice. Historical and cultural records show that gender diversity has existed across time and place, further debunking the notion that transgender identities are a modern trend. Most importantly, the acceptance of gender identity is crucial for the well-being of transgender individuals, particularly children and adolescents. Research consistently demonstrates that when transgender youth are affirmed, they thrive, whereas rejection leads to severe mental health consequences. Supporting gender identity is not about endorsing an ideology. It is about recognizing scientific reality and ensuring that all individuals, regardless of gender, can live healthy and fulfilling lives.